Welcome to the Historical Fiction Story Podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into a story called The Last of the Bright Young Things.
Okay.
It's set in 1932.
All right.
So think flapper dresses, transatlantic voyages, and all against the backdrop of the Great Depression.
Oh, wow.
And get this, we're going to experience this world through letters written between Dorothea, she's a young woman from a very wealthy family, and Herbert.
Mm-hmm.
Herbert works for a wealthy acquaintance of Dorothea's family.
So it's like we're getting two completely different perspectives on the same events.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story so interesting, right? You see, Dorothea's letters are filled with this kind of, naivete.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for instance, she encounters all these unemployed men in Liverpool, and she's totally surprised they're not at work.
Right.
It's as if she's completely out of touch with the economic struggles going on around her.
It's amazing how her wealth kind of shields her from what so many others were experiencing.
Yeah, it really highlights that class divide that existed back then.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's not just the unemployment that she seems to just brush over.
Right.
Remember the whole thing with the SS Sheldestad sinking?
Oh, yeah.
It was a huge maritime tragedy, and she's more worried about getting a new swimsuit.
I know. It's almost satirical, right? It's like the author is using these moments to kind of poke fun at the upper class's detachment.
Almost like a little wake-up call for us as readers, right?
Exactly. To remind us that there's a bigger picture here.
And I think that's one of the things that makes the story so brilliant, right?
Absolutely. And using letters was such a clever choice by the author. I mean, we get to see their thoughts unfiltered.
You really get a sense of their personalities.
Right. Their values. It's all right there.
Speaking of personalities, Herbert's letters are like the complete opposite of Dorothea's.
Oh, yeah.
He's grounded, compassionate, and super aware of everything that's happening around them.
So, while Dorothea is off at parties, Herbert's worried about those who are less fortunate.
Exactly. He even mentions donating money to help those affected by the shipwreck.
He's bringing us back to reality,
Exactly.
reminding us there's more to life than fancy parties.
It's really striking how their writing styles reflect their different personalities, too.
Yeah, Dorothea's letters are all light and gossipy.
And Herbert's are so much more, thoughtful and analytical.
Exactly. It's almost like a reflection of their social positions.
It is.
And, if you're loving this deep dive and you're craving more stories that explore different perspectives like this, you should absolutely check out the Historical Fiction Story Collection.
It's full of stories just like The Last of the Bright Young Things,
Mm.
But one thing that really stood out to me about Dorothea, it was her assumption that she and Herbert were engaged. He never actually proposed, but she just took it for granted.
I think that really reflects the social norms of the time. For women in her social circle, marriage was like the expected path.
And it's almost like she saw Herbert as her ticket to an even more lavish lifestyle.
Oh, I see.
And then there's that comment she makes about hoping Mr. Ross might accidentally overdose so Herbert could inherit his money.
Oh, wow.
It's meant to be funny, but it's also pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question her motives.
It does. It makes you wonder if she really cares for Herbert or if she's more interested in his potential wealth.
Yeah, the author really keeps us guessing there. It's really clever how the author uses characters like Dorothea to talk about these big societal issues. On the surface, she's just chasing wealth and status.
Right.
But it makes you think about the pressures on women back then.
Yeah. It's like she's trapped, surrounded by all this luxury, but she's missing something.
Right. There's no real connection, no purpose.
And then you have Herbert, who is so different.
Totally. He's not about possessions or climbing the social ladder.
He finds meaning in helping others and actually engaging with the world around him.
Absolutely.
His letters give us this glimpse into what was happening politically at the time. Remember, he mentions the national hunger marches.
Oh, yeah. The protests by those unemployed workers.
They wanted the government to do something about the poverty and unemployment.
And those marches were a big deal back then.
Yeah. They show how unhappy people were.
It was a time of real unrest.
And Herbert even talks about seeing a clash between the marchers and Oswald Mosley's fascist group.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of scary to think about how these extremist groups were gaining power.
It really adds another layer to the story, doesn't it?
It reminds you that it's not just a lighthearted romance.
Yeah.
There's this backdrop of serious social and political stuff happening.
Right. And then things get really interesting when Mr. Rice announces he's getting married.
Totally throws Dorothea's plans out the window.
It's like a turning point for both of them.
Yeah. And Dorothy's reaction is so telling. She's not happy for Mr. Ross at all.
Right. All she can talk about is how pretty his fiance's ankle is.
Like, she can't even imagine that he'd fall for someone who isn't rich or from a fancy family.
It just shows how superficial she is.
And then, bam, she's suddenly interested in Ronnie Montague.
Like it was Mr. Ross's money she was after all along.
Makes you wonder if she even knows what real love is.
Yeah, you're right.
But Herbert, he's actually relieved when he hears about the engagement.
Like a weight has been lifted off his shoulders.
He doesn't have to worry about inheriting all that money anymore.
It shows how strong he is. He wants to make his own choices.
I love the part where he talks about dancing a jig in the kitchen with the housekeeper.
It's such a great image.
So sweet. He finds joy in these simple things.
It's a big difference between him and Dorothea.
Totally. She wants all the external stuff.
And Herbert finds happiness in genuine connection.
Makes you think maybe he's the real last of the bright young things, you know?
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Not because of money or status, but because of his optimism and his kindness.
He believes in a better future.
And if you're enjoying this whole discussion about these characters and the historical stuff, you've got to check out the Historical Fiction Story Collection.
So many amazing stories there that'll transport you to different times and places.
And you know, one of the most interesting things about this story,
Yeah.
it's how the author doesn't tell us everything. Like, we have to read between the lines.
Oh, I know what you mean. Like, we never find out what happens with Mr. Ross and Ethel.
Right. Do they live happily ever after?
Who knows? The author leaves it up to us.
And then there's Dorothea's last letter. She suddenly stops writing to Herbert.
Yeah. She says it would be too upsetting.
But you kind of wonder what's really going on.
Right. Was she actually heartbroken or just annoyed that he wasn't going to be rich anymore?
The author leaves us with all these questions.
And that's what makes it so good. You have to think about it even after you've finished reading.
It makes you an active part of the story.
That's the power of good storytelling.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About all those choices people make.
It does. It's like the author really knew how to pack so much into a short story.
And yeah, we've talked a lot about Dorothea and Herbert and what makes them tick. But let's not forget about, the historical side of things. This story isn't just about them. It's like a window into that whole era.
Absolutely. It's a snapshot of the 1930s. The Depression, the unrest, the rise of those extremist groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Herbert's letters really bring those realities to life. Like when he mentions Oswald Mosley and the fascists.
Oh, right. The way they exploited people's fears and anxieties.
It's a good reminder that even during tough times, there are always people trying to take advantage of the situation.
It's a reminder for us today, too, to be careful about the information we consume.
Exactly. We need to think critically, especially with all the, the noise and polarization out there.
It's like the story is warning us not to just bury our heads in the sand.
We need to be aware of what's going on around us and, engage with the world.
And, who knows? Maybe by understanding the past, we can avoid repeating those mistakes.
And maybe even find ways to build a better future.
Speaking of understanding the past, remember you were wondering about how the story might be different if it was told from Ethel's perspective.
Oh, yeah. Imagine that.
Right. We'd get to know her side of things. What's her relationship with Mr. Ross really like?
Yeah. What does she think about Dorothea?
And what are her own dreams? I mean, maybe she's more than just a pretty ankle.
Maybe she's running a business or fighting for social change.
Exactly. It just goes to show how historical fiction opens up all these different possibilities.
It lets us explore so many different experiences.
And speaking of exploring, if you're craving more stories that'll take you to different times and places and really challenge you to think, you should check out the Historical Fiction Story Collection.
So many amazing stories to discover.
Definitely.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the last of the bright young things,
Yeah.
what are some of the, the big takeaways for you?
I think for me, it's how the story explores class and privilege and all the different ways people experience those events.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that happiness doesn't always come from having lots of money or a fancy title.
It's about those connections we make and being kind to others.
Exactly.
And just being, present in the world around us.
It's a good reminder.
I think another big thing is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
By getting to know Dorothea and Herbert, we get a better understanding of what people were going through back then.
And maybe that understanding can help us create a better world today.
That's a great thought.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the last of the bright young things. We hope you enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, there's always more to explore at the Historical Fiction Story Collection.
Definitely.
Until next time, keep reading and keep exploring those stories. Thank you for listening to the Historical Fiction Story Podcast.